Hello my bookish friends. In this video we're taking a look at 10 authors who in their day were considered great writers, who were beloved by the public, who sold plenty of books, but time seems to have moved on and forgotten the majority of them. And what we'll learn from this is that just because a book is old, it doesn't make it a piece of classic literature, which is often said by some people. Also, if you're interested in knowing what people used to like, you're going to hear some of the top authors that people used to read back in the day. And because people have always enjoyed good stories, I'm sure that within their oeuvre of each of these writers, there's probably some books which have got great tales to tell. So, without further ado, let's get into our 10 authors. Our first author on the list is none other than a good friend of Charles Dickens, and he came to prominence in the late Regency period, so the 1820s, 1830s, and then through Victorian era. And it's Edward Bulwer Lytton. He had a knack for picking out what the public liked to hear. He knew how to craft a story that kept them engaged with twists and turns. Books by him, The Last Days of Pompeii, Paul Clifford is maybe one of the most famous today of those who look into it. Eugene Aram is another one of his. But his first big seller was in 1828, and he lived until 1873, producing a lot of books through that time. He actually influenced Charles Dickens in changing the ending of Great Expectations. In my opinion, a mistake. But he did it because he knew what the public would like. So if you want to read stories which the public back then really enjoyed and captures the essence of the day, then go and read Edward Bulwer Lytton. Our second author on this list is the best-selling author in Victorian Britain. Between the decades of the 1880s to the 1910s, her books were flying off the shelves all over the British Isles, and it is Marie Corelli. In fact, her real name is Mary Mackay, but she changed it. Now, Corelli, she's writing at a time like George Eliot is writing, Thomas Hardy is writing, Arthur Conan Doyle is writing, you know, big names that we know today, but you've probably never heard of Corelli herself, and yet the public lapped up her stuff. She was quite esoteric. She tried to write about Christianity and how it fits with reincarnation and astral planes and mysticism. And people loved her books. Now, the critics were quite harsh. They said it wasn't very literary. They talked about her being melodramatic and over the top. But she had some big patrons. The royal family read her stuff. Victoria, you know, the Empress, she read Corelli. Winston Churchill collected her works. And the writer R.K. Narayan, he said that her books always left him feeling crushed at the end. She clearly had an ability to make emotions move, and some people accuse her of being overly sentimental, melodramatic, but she was seriously popular in her day. So if you want to know what the British public were reading back then you've got to read Marie Corelli, because she was without doubt Victorian Britain's bestseller. In fact, I believe she wrote 30 works which each sold over 100,000 copies. I mean, that is extraordinary. Now, you think Marie Corelli sounds good. We've just said she was the best-selling Victorian author, but the next writer was the best-selling novelist in the English-speaking world between the mid-1890s through to almost 1920, and it's a writer called Hall Caine. Have you heard of him? He was beloved by the public, the first person to sell 1 million books in a global way. Hall Caine was actually called by the critics the English Tolstoy. People said he was as good as Tolstoy, was going to be as good as Tolstoy. I mean, that's serious acclaim. Whether he lives up to it, well, you'd have to read and judge for yourself. The Manxman is one of his most famous books because he comes from the little Isle of Man, principality next to Great Britain. And his works, like Tolstoy, I suppose, he talks about themes like adultery, domestic violence, religious bigotry, all that kind of stuff, ploughing deep into our experience with others and the world that we inhabit. And he was actually knighted for his services in literature. So there you go, the best-selling writer in the English-speaking world in his day, Hall Caine. Now, the next author is someone, depending on how much you've read from the Regency period and just before, you may know, but most have forgotten, is Frances Burney. Now, Frances Burney was beloved in her day and very well respected, although she had to write often under a pseudonym because she was a woman. Jane Austen absolutely loved Frances Burney. She was an inspiration to her. Frances Burney was an inspiration to Maria Edgeworth, and you can sort of see a bit of a pattern in the writing in places. But even Samuel Johnson considered Frances Burney a sublime writer, and Samuel Johnson writes some of the best literary criticism you will ever read. Cecilia, Evelina, they're two of the big books that Frances Burney writes, and she's got this art of satirizing society and characters which Jane Austen develops, I would say, in a better way. This woman, by the way, was an absolute legend. She wrote some non-fiction. She was busy travelling with her husband. She even describes undergoing a double mastectomy in France without anaesthetic. And it's both horrifying and gripping at the same time when you read her account. So that's the next one, Frances Burney. We're already at our fifth author who was stupendously popular in their own time, but many have forgotten. And this one is an American murder mystery writer. It is Mary Roberts Rinehart. Have you heard of Rinehart or read any of her books? She was called the Agatha Christie of America. That's some acclaim, because we all know who Agatha Christie is. And actually it makes me want to do a video comparing some murder mysteries from like Christie and Allingham and Rinehart and Ngaio Marsh, who I was introduced to in my Patreon community. And I'm very grateful for that. So how popular was Rinehart? She started, I think, a first big takeoff was The Circular Staircase. She was on the New York bestsellers list for 40 years straight. I mean, that is incredible. That tells you how popular she was. She also is credited with the "if only I'd known then what I knew now" kind of trope in murder mysteries. Like, I overheard a conversation which, had I realised how important it was, I could have said something and the murderer wouldn't have killed 3 other people because they would have been caught. That kind of stuff, which, whether we mock it or not, does sort of get us when we're reading it, whether we like to admit it or not. So that's number 5, Mary Roberts Rinehart. Now, I just want to interrupt this video with a word from our sponsors, which is you, the viewer. If you love classic literature and you appreciate videos and enjoy videos like this, and you'd like to support my channel, consider going over to my Patreon and joining my Patreon community, where every month we have a book which we read together, a classic book. We have a discussion about a week after we've finished it. And also I add exclusive content there with videos behind the scenes and videos on aspects of literature and reading to become better readers. So if that sounds good to you and you'd like to support the channel, go over to my Patreon. Right, back to the list. Our 6th author is a classic author and is well known for one particular classic to this day, but most people have never read any other works or know even how popular he was. Do you know who it is if I give you the famous work of his, New Grub Street? It's George Gissing. Now, George Gissing wrote primarily between the 1890s to his death in 1903, even had a book published posthumously. In that time, he wrote 20-something novels. And the public absolutely lapped it up, but so did the critics. George Orwell said of George Gissing that he was perhaps the finest writer of the English language, of the English novel, and called New Grub Street one of the finest, maybe the finest English novel of all. Remember what characters are writing at this time, like massively big characters in literature. And what Gissing was very good at, very much as a realist, he got the life of a writer down really well in New Grub Street. I highly recommend that book. It's got social realism as well, very deeply drawn characters with psychology going on behind them. And it is a bit slower moving than you may be used to with certain books, but absolutely brilliantly put together. But of course, New Grub Street is not his only work. There are 20 others to go and pick from, or 20 something others to go and pick from. Why don't you take a look? If you like a good writer, then George Gissing won't let you down. Our seventh writer was extraordinarily popular as well in the 19th century and known for her drama and her exotic settings and passionate romances with her characters. Of course, all things which we love today and grip the public back then. Her name is Marie-Louise Ramée, but you may better know her by her pen name, Ouida. She wrote Under Two Flags is probably her most famous work, set in North Africa. Her works were translated into stage and early film because she was so beloved by people, and her work sold a lot. Other works of hers would be like Moths and Marimar or another, all set in a very exotic setting and gripping. It's said that Oscar Wilde thought that she was pretty good. He said apparently that she had a great flair for the dramatic. And of course, Oscar Wilde liked a bit of drama himself. I don't know how true that statement is from Wilde, but so the story goes anyway. But that is Ouida, an exceedingly popular writer in the latter end of the Victorian period. Our eighth author was seriously beloved by the public in the early through to going on the late Victorian age, but also beloved by other great writers who considered him one of the best writers going, especially, and if you like historical fiction, you'll be especially interested in this writer. It is Charles Reade. Now, does that name ring a bell to you? Maybe not, but if you've been looking at literature for a while, you may have come across one particular work of his, which is rather large and a historical fiction. It's called The Cloister and the Hearth. This is a magnificent book. It's set in continental Europe, and it discusses, this does not make it sound interesting at all, it discusses the difficulties between a man's obligation to church and to family. That doesn't really sell it. He details out people's lives. He writes brilliant characters. Conan Doyle, in a little list of things that he loves, which you can find in a museum in America, says his favourite heroine is Margaret from The Cloister and the Hearth by Charles Reade. He actually said that there's no other book that combines the heart and the head so well in writing. Rudyard Kipling, another great writer and poet, said that he just wished that in his life he could write one work that could lie alongside The Cloister and the Hearth by Charles Reade, and that was followed up by another great book, Hard Cash. So that's our eighth writer, Charles Reade, author of one of the greatest forgotten historical novels ever written. Our next writer was prolific, and the public just lapped it up. It's Margeret Oliphant. Have you come across Margeret Oliphant? Probably, because if you look into popular writers of the Victorian age, she is going to come right up there in a list, because she wrote like nearly or above 100 novels. I mean, imagine that. Charles Dickens thought she was a great storyteller. He actually employed her to write for his magazine Household Words. Virginia Woolf praised her for her domestic realism and thought she was an extraordinary woman because, like, she had, was it like 13 kids or maybe more, and neighbours and other family members and hangers-on who all relied on her to pay for them and to feed them and clothe and house them. And she did that through this prolific, prodigious output. And I can't imagine the effort. She must have been quite some character and quite the force of nature to just produce that much literature. Miss Marjoribanks is probably her most famous novel. She's not my particular cup of tea. She tends to moralise quite a bit, and I don't mind moralising, by the way, but just to let you know, she does do that, and she draws quite distinct good and bad characters. But she's also known for her series, what's that called? The Chronicles of Carlingford, I believe it is. If you want to get into Victorian literature and know what people in the day loved and resonated with and Actually, it influences the social discourse of the day and what matters are important to people, then go and read something by Margeret Oliphant. And so we come to our 10th and final author, who was remarkably popular in the United States in particular. In fact, this woman is called the Queen of American detective fiction. Do you know who it is? Because I've never heard of her. It's someone called Carolyn Wells. She was called America's Agatha Christie, though she started writing like over a decade before Christie put pen to paper. So Carolyn Wells, you think Margeret Oliphant was prodigious with 100 books. Carolyn Wells apparently wrote 170 books. I mean, imagine that. Did she do anything else? She started with children's literature and poems and stuff, but after reading a mystery, she turned her attention to writing detective fiction. And from what I found out, she has a detective series where I think the detective's called Fleming Stone. There are 62 novels in that series. So you think of Poirot and you think of Miss Marple. Like, there's more Fleming Stone novels than them combined. And like I say, she was called the Queen of Detective Fiction. Have you even heard of her? You may have if you're in America, but I've certainly never heard of her in Britain, and I never hear her mentioned anywhere on YouTube. Not many of these authors in this list are mentioned much in the BookTube community or BookTok or wherever you watch. But I've heard of most of them. I've read a lot of them as well, albeit one book. But not Carolyn Wells. And so when I do my video comparing detective fiction, just because I love murder mysteries and that, I'm going to stick Carolyn Wells on that list. I hope that you've enjoyed this quick run through 10 authors who in their day were incredibly popular with the public. But for some reason, time has almost forgotten them. We're just not aware of them anymore. I would say, for instance, Caine maybe has a few books some know of. The most famous would definitely be New Grub Street by Gissing. Most people have heard of that one. But the rest have just sort of disappeared into the mists. Now, this is great because I'll be doing a video soon on myths about classic literature. One of them being classics are just old books. Well, no, they're not, because these are all old books and they're not classics. They haven't lasted. However, if you want good stories, one of the best ways to find them is to see what lots and lots and lots of people enjoyed. And that's one thing about these authors. In their day, they were extraordinarily popular. Some of them over decades, 4 decades, some of them. And I'm sure within those works, there are going to be books that you and I would really enjoy. Of course, they're written for their day, and so sensibilities change and styles change, like melodrama is not so popular with us anymore. Moralizing, not so popular anymore. However, that doesn't mean to say there's not some good stuff in there. Also, if you like history and you want to immerse yourself in the time period, one of the best ways you can get used to a historic period is read what the public were reading. It gives you an idea of how people felt and thought and what they enjoyed. And obviously, those books draw, especially Bulwer Lytton, draws on famous characters to lampoon them and to write them sort of, you don't give the exact name to the character, but the public recognise some of the characters within, like Fauntleroy, the embezzler, the fraud. Bulwer Lytton puts him in one of his books. So, yes. Tell me which ones below really grab your attention. I know I'm going to be looking at Carolyn Wells, and I need to go and do The Cloister and the Hearth by Charles Reade, which, do you know, I don't think I finished it. And I don't think that was because it didn't grip me. Because I can remember part of it, but not later. I know what happens in the end. But it is a big book. And maybe that's what got me. I read it, well, I was reading it years and years and years ago. So whether my young spirit couldn't cope getting all the way through, I'm really going to have to go back to it. But it's finding the book. I've got it on Kindle, but I just find a large book hard to read on Kindle. And so I need to find a physical copy that's not like £200 to buy. Anyway, I'm waffling now. If you've enjoyed this video, hit like and Subscribe and leave a comment. Do you know, if you want to really, really help me, leave a comment. It promotes the video through the YouTube algorithm. So until the next time, I wish you joy in whatever you read.